Then we take a look at the Chinese situation, a short look. I know the Chinese situation worse than I know the Japanese one. But I wanted to speak first about the Nishikawa Keisai and Hakuseki, because often the fall of Chinese civilization is placed at the Opium War. But it actually started earlier. The rules of this game here is that Chinese authors try to acquire practical information on European geopolitics. But at this time they try to retain the Chinese cosmology as much as possible. So we had the Opium War, 1840-43, Britain against the Chinese. And this was a world-shattering war here in the East because the British, who were so far away based and came by ship to the Chinese coast, were so superior against Chinese forces. In Canton, in the prefecture of Canton, we had the leader of the place, Lin Zhishu, and he started collecting all kinds of information of these British foreign barbarians that he could do. He collected many kinds of material, and then because of this, he was sent to internal exile and taken away from his post. The Chinese rulers considered it as a bad thing to try to learn barbarian knowledge. Wei Yuan was his underling, not the high official, in whose hands these notes and miscellaneous collections of papers were left. And he compiled them into a book and published it as Haigua Tucci in 1842, the first edition, a new one in 1847, and the third one in 1852. This was not a too good book, because much of the information in the book was from the Jesuit period, 200 years earlier. It was quite outdated, yet it was something. And some new information also was in the book. But anyway, it became very important. Even after Hakuseki tried to limit the trade between China and Japan, lots of trade still continued. And this book arrived in Japan already in 1848, but it was banned by the Japanese Bakufu. Also because it contained wrong kind of knowledge. But it came in other ships. Next time in 1850, and it spread in over 20 editions in Japan. Illegal editions, people simply took it and printed new editions from it. Not necessarily the whole book, parts of it, but it spread. And especially in Satsuma clan and the one that was in Shikoku, Shochu in Shikoku, they used to read this book quite a lot, and also others. So it was also waking the Japanese up before Japan was nominally opened. Another thing about this story is that China was still very important in Japan at this time. Because also the Japanese could have all this information gathered through yogaku or rangaku through the years, and they still could interview the Dutch in Nagasaki. This book actually was more important than this time because it was from China, written in Chinese. What does Wei say in the book? And I don't read this in Chinese. You can do if you want. Chinese sounds good.
これは現代の中国語ではないです。
これ古いですよ。
世书何以作？曰：为以仪公仪而作，为以仪款仪而作，为师夷长技以制夷。
And what is written in these books? They teach to use barbarians to overcome barbarians, to use barbarians to deal with barbarians, and to learn barbarian advanced skills to control barbarians. This does not sound too much nowadays, because we are used to the idea that ideas move across borders and you learn from foreign countries. But this was a revolutionary idea in China at that time. There was no lack of Chinese debate at this time. That there are barbarians outside. They are strong and they are threatening. But the Chinese idea at this time was, what can Chinese learn from Chinese knowledge and Chinese history to strengthen themselves and then deal with the barbarians? And Wei advocated that this policy does not work anymore. You have to learn from the barbarians new things. He himself was not banished because he was a low-level official, but he sort of retired and went to actually Buddhist monastery later, because he was also scolded a lot in China because of these kind of ideas. Tsukumo Shozan is a famous Japanese 19th century person who also advocated the same kind of thing. He got Wei's book, read it with interest, thought that how he has met a kindred spirit, a person who thinks the same way as he does. And his famous slogan, Toyo no Dotoku, Seiyo no Geijutsu, the Japanese should retain Eastern morals and Western technology to deal with the Westerners, is from him. He published this in 1856. Died in 1864. He was assassinated because he was considered to be too friendly to the Westerners and their ideas. Also here you see Toyo and Seiyo. After Hakuseki, these had become, in more than a century, 1.5 centuries, quite normal words in Japan nowadays already. And Toyo here includes also China. So it is quite different way that Chinese were using that concept at that time. And Shozan is not talking about Asia, but Toyo is what was acceptable and good for the Japanese at this time. When we go to the book of Wei, he used this ocean terminology, and he placed China in the center of the world, and he was now also talking about Eastern and Southern and Western and Northern oceans. China did not belong into any of them. So he did not accept European geographic names. He only placed their practical information. The idea was that China should no more look inland. It should start looking to the wide oceans of the world and acquire knowledge from there. He also could point out to history, because Buddhism is an idea, a culture, religion, civilization that has come from outside to China. And in its own time, it was useful also in China. So now he argued that it is time to do this kind of act again. But he retained always Chinese centrality. I don't go more closely into the book, because as I'm looking at the concepts, this is enough for me. One more thing. Or two more things, or three more things. So from land to sea, new orientation. Then he also advocated an active foreign policy towards neighbors. Korea, Japan, Ryukyu, and so on. He advocated starting much more trade, much more diplomatic activity with these countries, because they were within the Chinese cultural sphere. They were sort of natural allies who should be taken more and closer into contact with the Chinese and create an alliance with them against the Westerners. And then it was also important to get knowledge of the Westerners themselves, because he soon found out that the British are not necessarily so strong in Europe itself. There's Russia, there's France, there are the German principalities and so on, who compete with the British. And to befriend some of them and divide and rule the Westerners was also possible. We can see these terms also here and there, because he was using, it was partly simply a compilation. He took texts from here and there and put them together. And there you can see many names also. This Asia. Also he himself did not use it, they appear in the book. But he never attempted even to unify the different ways of writing the name. So it was not yet a very deeply thought out compilation. But other variants had existed there also through the centuries. Xu Jiyu is another one. He was the governor of a prefecture a little north of Canton, who also published a book, Yinghuan Xilua, a short account of the maritime circuit. In 1848, it was banned. He was sent to internal exile for two decades. From 1866, it began to be used as a textbook, because the Chinese or the Manchu government created a school for diplomats in Beijing, meant to deal with the Westerners, and this began to be used as a textbook. It was used as a textbook until 1911, more than half a century after the book was published. And even in 1848, the book still contained lots of the same information that they had used, which was 200 years old. So even in 1911, they were reading information of Europe that was 400 years old, which again tells how difficult it is for a great empire to start to renew itself. Okay, I go inside of this book with this story. He tells the history of China and Europe, like this. Originally, Europeans had eaten meat and worn animal skins just like Mongols. Until during the Xia dynasty 4,000 years ago, civilization had flown westwards from China and established agriculture in Greece. When the Han dynasty 2,000 years ago, Rome had established a civilized system of government that united Europe. Unlike China, Europe was not able to maintain the traditional unity, succumbing soon to warfare. During Tang dynasty 1,000 years ago, China invented the cannon and gunpowder, keeping with them Muslims away. But when Timur Lenk, during the 15th century, used a lot of European mercenaries in his army, via them the cannon finally found its way to Europe, enabling it to start its expansion. First Europeans took all over America, then India and islands in the South Sea. And then they had come on the borders of China. What he's doing here is that he is, once again, retaining Chinese centrality. The book was supposed to be a geography of the whole world, but he never wrote about China, except in these kind of stories. So he did not need to place China into Western geographic concepts, simply left it out. And still the idea here is that all civilization of the world flows out from China. Much of this history is true. Not the agriculture. It was created in Egypt and Mesopotamia, perhaps in many places in the world separately. But there were relations in the Roman period. Also China at that time was not yet important. But the cannon and the gunpowder, it is a true story. So he is retaining Chinese centrality. He also has a curious way of writing countries into addresses. For instance, he has the European concept, Asia, and then he has Tokyo, and two countries. So it is an address in the world. He combines them both. So he does not allow the European concept to stand alone. It is there, he uses it, then he explains it with the Chinese concept. So in the Asia, Eastern Ocean, we have two countries, Japan and Ryukyu. Or in Asia and the Southern Ocean continent, we have many countries, and so on. The same also with Europe. We have Europe and Western Ocean, where he counted Spain and Italy, France, and from the Dutch onward, upwards it was Europe, Northern Ocean, and so on. So European concepts come, but carefully, very carefully. And something that never was in the text is Asia, Eastern Ocean, raging, or Asia, Eastern Ocean, central country. Never this. So China said sort of outside all this geography, here on a shelf, and then the world geography, according to European understanding, was here. Another thing, descriptions of Europeans. I'm showing you this because these tell about the closeness and distance between people. Europeans are tall and big, with white skin, protruding nose, deep-set eyes, and a lot of bird connecting with moustache, or going around the cheeks, which is a thing directly resembling the Chinese. Now here we have a realistic description of the Europeans. No more as strange devils with red hair and nose like hawks and so on. So we are getting sort of, if not completely equal level with Chinese and Europeans, then at least near. It's no more like this, but somewhere here now. And also Asia is explained sensibly. Asia is originally the old name for Turkish Anatolia, but Westerners named all the land from there to the East Asia. Completely sensible, true information. So this is as far as he went, a combination of new European and old Chinese characters. yet still containing a lot of old information. Aha. But there were also places where he did not accept European information. And this map of Japan is an example. To your eyes, it may look as if Japan is drawn in a strange position. It is not. Japan is in the correct position. But this is not Hokkaido. This is Tsushima, the island between Kyushu and Korea. And this is the western end of Kyushu. These are some small islands south from Kyushu, and this is Ryukyu. And here we have Taiwan. Because he used in his description of Japan information from Chinese traders who came to Nagasaki. And he did not want to accept European knowledge in any place that was within the Chinese civilization. He thought Chinese information must be more reliable. So there are clear limits to what could be accepted and what could not. Then the Chinese clearly were progressing. Then we had the Chinese started to kill each other. Rebellions, the Taiping, Tianguo, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. It is great history. It's still considered as the second biggest military conflict in terms of dead people in the history of humankind. The Second World War was biggest, and this is the second biggest. And the First World War was the third. Simply so many people died in this conflict, which lasted almost 15 years. It was like a world war. And it was also a world war in terms of civilizational categories, because the Taipings had very fast created a new ideology based partly on Christianity. The leader considered himself to be the second son of God. Jesus was the first and he was the second son. And they also had a very revolutionary social agenda, complete equality, also gender equality. And it was strongly directed against the Manchu rulers, to kill the Manchus and drive them away, and return China into a Chinese country. And it took lots of resources from the Manchu government to put this rebellion down, and it was followed by other small rebellions, by Muslims and others over the years. And what happened inside China was that the Chinese Manchu opposition became more immediate and more important than the China-West opposition. Which meant that an additional, very strong inhibition towards importing Western knowledge, because Western knowledge clearly created this kind of rebellions. So it was considered dangerous and could be accepted in China only in small doses. They can be compared with the Meiji Ishin, Meiji Restoration, who was also done by rebellious, peripheral Japanese clans who had acquired Western knowledge and technologies. If they had succeeded in creating their own empire, the Chinese history might have been quite different, but they did not. China remained in the state of internal warfare for about 100 years after this. And this created a situation where Japan was, from the early 20th century till about these days, we are now living interesting times, able to place itself as the center, the economic and political center in East Asia, and so to eclipse China for 100 years. And this period is now ending, which is interesting to see how it all goes for all of us.